The record number of fires burning across Brazil's Amazon rainforest has prompted renewed global outcry over climate change. And big spending. $5 million from Leonardo DiCaprio, £10 million from the UK. Meanwhile, Bill Gates is backing the first high-altitude experiment of one radical climate change solution, creating a massive chemical cloud that could cool the Earth. It's called solar geoengineering, and it's highly controversial. It would look something like this. Thousands of planes would fly very high and use nozzles to inject millions of tons of light-reflecting particles into the stratosphere. It would create a thin chemical cloud of those particles around the whole planet, blocking some sunlight from reaching the surface. It would mimic a giant volcanic eruption, which we know cools the Earth. Back in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. It was the largest eruption to affect a densely populated area, creating avalanches and giant mud flows that left more than 700 dead and 30,000 homeless. It also spewed a cloud of 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide particles into the stratosphere. That chemical cloud was hundreds of miles across and reflected about 2% of sunlight back to space. And in 1992, the Earth was cooler than in 1991.
That is part of the mechanism, but you do this in a controlled way.
Modelling studies have found that it could reduce the intensity of heat waves, for instance. Apparently it could reduce the rate of sea level rise. It could reduce the intensity of tropical storms.
But it also comes with significant risks and uncertainties.
Things like mass famine, mass flooding, drought, of kinds that will affect very large populations.
It could weaken monsoons in India, China, and Africa enough to affect crops. It could eradicate blue sky.
You start increasing the amount of diffuse light and you have less direct light, which is the same thing as saying it looks hazy and white.
And if the global community decides it should stop?
So you stop injecting it, and after a year, the cloud is gone, and you get this rapid warming at a rate much faster than you would get if we had done nothing. If you've taken out the greenhouse gases that are adding to the warming, then the temperature won't go up, it'll stay what it is. So if we don't stop emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we don't try as hard as we can to do that, then there's no point in doing solar geoengineering.
A 2016 opinion poll conducted by the Harvard group doing solar geoengineering research found that 67% of subjects support its use. One reason this technology is appealing, it's cheap. One study estimates it would cost an average of $2.25 billion globally every year for the first 15 years of deployment. Compare that to the $500 billion the US government estimates it will cost just the US by 2100 if no action is taken against climate change. Or the $1.6 to $3.8 trillion projected global spending by 2050 on low-carbon energy production. You can also compare it to direct air carbon capturing, another climate change solution backed by Bill Gates and by big oil. It involves sucking billions of tons of carbon out of the air. And at $100 to $200 a ton, it could be big business. Solar geoengineering, on the other hand, is so cheap that nobody currently stands to make money from the process.
But just because a solution is cheap doesn't make it a good one. It's cheap and dangerous.
Bill Gates is among a dozen individual donors and 14 foundations backing the first stratospheric solar geoengineering experiment out of Harvard. It's called Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment, or SCOPEX. A high-altitude balloon will lift instruments about 20 kilometers into the stratosphere, where it will release less than 2 kilograms of different naturally occurring chemicals, like calcium carbonate and sulfates, and then measure the change in atmospheric chemistry and light scattering. The Harvard group that runs SCOPEX and other experiments has raised more than $16 million, more than double any other solar geoengineering effort. And annual global funding has gone up from $1 million in 2008 to $8 million in 2018, with the majority of that funding coming from the US. The first phase of SCOPEX will cost around $3 million, with much more needed for wider research on solar geoengineering. To this point, stratosphere injections have only been tested with climate modeling. In the UK, a government-funded solar radiation management test called SPICE was cancelled in 2012 because of issues with patents. A study last year found that no existing aircraft can inject the stratosphere at a high enough altitude, but developing a new high-altitude tanker would not be technologically difficult or prohibitively expensive. Nozzles still need to be designed that can continuously blast out trillions of particles, and scientists still need to decide what chemicals those particles should be made of. But unlike cloud brightening, which is another solar reflection technique, the tech needed for stratospheric injections is not far off.
The technology is not the main thing that's holding this back. The main thing that's holding it back is the uncertainty about what the exact effects would be and the positives and negatives of its effects, and the governance and decision-making process for implementing it.
Modelling evidence gathered over the last decade has pretty consistently found that a moderate amount of solar geoengineering could significantly reduce many of the impacts of climate change.
Die Nichtregierungsorganisation Facing Finance hat die Steuererklärung der Gates Stiftung aus dem Jahr 2018 untersucht und kritisiert. Die Investitionen und die eigenen moralischen Ansprüche der Bill und Melinda Gates Stiftung stimmen nicht überein.
Zum Beispiel Beteiligung an dem britischen Waffenhersteller BAE Systems. Dieses Unternehmen ist involviert aktuell in Waffenlieferungen als Zulieferer für den Jemenkrieg. Dann finden wir eine ganze Reihe von klimaschädlichen Investments in Bezug auf die Ölindustrie, auf die Kfz-Industrie, auf Fluggesellschaften. Man findet eine ganze Reihe von Kohleunternehmen, in die die Stiftung investiert.
So hielt die Gates Stiftung 2018 über den Trust Anteile am brasilianischen Bergbaukonzern Vale, dem Menschenrechtsverletzungen und Umweltzerstörung vorgeworfen werden. Vale wird angeklagt, verantwortlich zu sein für den Dammbruch einer Mine Anfang letzten Jahres. 270 Menschen kamen dabei ums Leben. Darüber hinaus investiert die Gates Stiftung in gewinnbringende Süßgetränkehersteller, Süßwaren und Alkoholkonzerne. Bill Gates führe seine Stiftung wie einst sein Unternehmen Microsoft, in erster Linie gewinn- und profitorientiert, so die Kritik des Gesundheitsexperten Thomas Gebauer.
Es ist eine Kombination aus Kapital, aus Managementfaktoren, ein bisschen Wissen und so weiter und versucht mit dieser Art des unternehmerischen Handelns auch Gesundheit wie eine Ware zu vertreiben. Und das ist falsch.